Roy Decker had owned that B-61 Mack for 18 years and never once opened the floor of the cab. He bought it on a Tuesday in April of 1987 at the Tri-County Equipment Sale outside Roanoke, Virginia. The auction was winding down. Most of the serious buyers had already gone home. The flatbeds and rollbacks had sold well. The Kenworths moved fast. What was left at the back of the lot by 2 in the afternoon were the machines that nobody had a use for or the patience to haul away. The B-61 sat at the far end of row 7. It was a 1959 model, forest green gone the color of old pond water, the chrome strip above the grille pitted down to bare metal. The Mack Bulldog hood ornament was still there, but leaning 5 degrees left. Someone had painted the word parts across the passenger door in White House paint. Uneven letters, like the man who did it was already walking away when he finished the last one. The boom was a fixed twin-post Holmes 501, 18 feet of steel that hadn't been hydraulic since the factory built it. Mechanical winch. Chain drive PTO off the back of the 5-speed. 14,000 pounds of cable drum that turned when you fed it throttle and stopped when you let off. The Mack dealer who ran the lot was a man named Curtis Ellerby. He wore a BOLO tie and drove a Lincoln Town car and had opinions about every piece of iron on the property. He was not a man who kept opinions to himself. Roy was 34 years old that spring. He ran a one-truck towing operation out of a rented bay in Bodator County, pulling cars from ditches on Route 11, doing roadside work the big companies didn't want. His truck was a 1974 Ford F600 with a home-fabricated boom that shook when the cable loaded up past 8,000 pounds. It worked until it didn't, and some nights it didn't at inconvenient times. He needed something with real capacity. He had $1,900 in cash and no intention of borrowing the rest. He'd driven 3 hours to Roanoke on the strength of a 2-line listing in a trade paper. 1959 Mack B-61, Holmes 501 boom, as is. No price given. He'd known about the B-61 since he was a boy. His uncle Wallace had run one out of Lexington for 20 years, and Roy had spent enough Saturdays in that cab watching Wallace work to know what the truck could do in the right hands. The B-61 was built from 1953 to 1966. Straight-six Thermodyne diesel, 170 horsepower at the crank, a torque curve that peaked so low you could run the winch at little more than idle and still move weight that would strain a modern truck's hydraulic system. The cab was rounded, almost bulbous by later standards, the split windshield divided by a chrome strip. The dash a simple arrangement of analog gauges that told you what you needed to know and nothing else. Roy walked the truck twice before Curtis Ellerby drifted over. Ellerby sized Roy up the way men size up other men at auctions. The clothes, the truck in the lot, the absence of a company logo on anything. What are you thinking? Ellerby said. What's it got in the engine? Whatever Mack left in there in '59. I wouldn't know. Haven't started it. Previous owner drove it in under its own power 8 years ago and parked it. Motors probably sludged to the bottom of the pan. Roy crouched down and looked at the undercarriage. Frame rails were solid. Rear axle housing showed surface rust, nothing structural. The tires were cracked but held air. Transmission, Roy said, 5-speed. I assume. Could be a rock for all I know. Ellerby lit a cigarette and glanced at his watch. Listen, Roy said. I'll give you $200 for it. Ellerby laughed through his nose. The sound carried across the row. A couple of other men turned to look. Son, the scrap weight alone on that chassis is worth $250. $325 cash. Right now. I'll load myself. Ellerby looked at the truck. He looked at Roy. He looked at his watch again. You know what that boom weighs? Ellerby said. You know what the winch housing alone weighs? That truck's been parked for 8 years. You got a $1,000 tow bill just getting it home, and then you got nothing but an anchor with a Mack logo. Roy stood up. $325. Ellerby shook his head, but he wasn't walking away. He pulled on the cigarette. You got kids? Roy waited. Because only a man with no kids or too many kids spends $325 on a dead Mack to haul home and stare at. Ellerby gestured toward a blue 1983 Peterbilt rollback, 3 rows over, clean cab, pneumatic boom, a truck that actually ran. I'll put you in that Peterbilt for $4,000. Terms. You'd have something to work with by Friday. $325 cash. That's what I've got for this one. Ellerby dropped the cigarette and stepped on it. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a receipt book. $325. You haul it by into business today, or I'm charging you $50 a day storage. Roy paid him in 20s and a 5. Ellerby counted it and wrote the receipt without looking up. Good luck with your anchor, Ellerby said, and walked toward the payment tent. Roy backed a rented lowboy trailer up to the B-61 before 4 o'clock. The wheels rolled stiffly, but they rolled. He strapped it down himself, drove 3 hours back to Boudetort County with the B-61 swaying in the dark behind him, and pulled it into his bay just after 9 at night. He stood under the fluorescent light, looking at it for 20 minutes before he went inside. His wife, Connie, was at the kitchen table with their daughter, who was 7. She looked at him with the measured expression of a woman who has been married to a mechanic long enough to know when not to ask questions right away. How bad? She said. He thought about it. Not bad, he said. Different kind of bad than most. If you're here because old iron with a story to tell is your kind of thing, hit subscribe. These machines don't show up on the algorithm, and your support is what keeps them coming. Thank you. The first week, Roy didn't try to fix anything. He cleaned. He pulled 4 inches of gum and leaf pack out of the air cleaner. He drained the sludge from the crankcase, gray-black oil thick as cold molasses, and refilled it 3 times with diesel flush. He freed the brake drums with heat and a 3-pound hammer. He pulled the injectors and soaked them in penetrant for 5 days. He found things that surprised him. The cab floor had been replaced at some point, welded steel plate over the original wood, a clean professional job, the kind of work a man does when he plans to keep something for a long time. This truck had been maintained with real attention. Whatever had put in that lot had nothing to do with neglect. The engine freed on the 22nd day. Roy had been rotating the crank by hand for 3 weeks, a quarter turn per session, soaking the cylinders between each attempt. On the morning of the 22nd day, it turned a full rotation. He poured fresh oil in and went to get coffee. When he came back, he put a wrench on the crankshaft bolt and turned it by hand through 2 full revolutions and felt the compression come up even across all 6 cylinders. He put the injectors back in, poured diesel down the fuel lines by hand, put the battery cables on a charger overnight. Connie heard the engine from the kitchen. She came out to the bay in her coat, their daughter behind her holding a stuffed rabbit by one ear. Roy was sitting in the cab with his hands on the wheel and the Thermodyne diesel running beneath him at a low, even idle, a sound that had not been made by this machine in 8 years. The gauges read steady. Oil pressure was up. Coolant temperature was climbing toward normal. He sat there without saying anything. His daughter climbed up on the running board and looked through the window at the gauges. Is it working? She said. It's working, Roy said. Ellerby's wrong again, his daughter said. She had heard the phone call 6 weeks earlier, the one where Ellerby had called to offer Roy $150 for the truck as is delivered. Roy had turned him down without discussion. The engine ran for 40 minutes that first morning while Roy watched the gauges. When he shut it down and climbed out, he stood next to the driver's door with his hand on the fender the way you put your hand on a horse's neck after it's done something hard. The metal was warm from the engine heat. 2 months later, Roy had the truck running and licensed. By the summer of 1987, he was using it for real recovery work. The Holmes 501 pulled straight, and the cable was sound. The B-61 handled bad ground-the-way trucks from that era handled bad ground, with weight placed low and a drivetrain that had no electronics to argue with the driver's judgment. He kept the F-600 for light work and used the Mack for anything that needed real cable or real boom. The 2 trucks together gave him a spread of capacity that let him say yes to jobs he'd been turning down for 3 years. By 1989, he had steady contracts with 2 county sheriff's departments and a pipeline company working the ridgeline routes. Curtis Ellerby's dealership closed in 1991. Roy heard about it from a parts supplier in Salem who said Ellerby had overextended on a lot in Lynchburg. Roy didn't remark on it. He sent Ellerby no message. He had work to do, and the Mack was running fine. He never opened the floor of the cab. There was no reason to. The replacement plate was solid, the welds were clean, the truck worked. Some things you leave alone when they don't need attention. Roy was not a man who went looking for problems in machinery that was doing its job. That changed in the spring of 2005. The spring of 2005 was the 18th year Roy had owned the B-61, and it started the way most trouble starts, with something small that shouldn't have mattered. He was pulling the cab apart to reseal the firewall. The original rubber gasket had finally dried through, and diesel fumes were coming up through the floor on long hauls. Standard maintenance, the kind of job he'd done on a dozen trucks over the years. He pulled the seat. He pulled the floor mat. He was reaching for the first bolt on the steel floor plate when he noticed something he had overlooked for 18 years. The welds on the replacement plate were not continuous. Along 3 edges, they ran clean and full, the work of a man who knew what he was doing. Along the 4th edge, the edge closest to the firewall, the welds were different, shorter, spaced, the kind of welds you put on a panel you intend to remove again someday, or that you close up fast because you're out of time or out of gas in the tank. Roy sat on the running board with a flashlight and looked at those welds for a long time. He thought about the reloomed wiring, the fresh transmission seals, the way the engine had been preserved, cylinders oiled, coolant drained, and replaced with rust inhibitor. Someone had spent real time on this truck before it went to that lot. Someone who knew machinery and cared about it had prepared this truck for something, and Roy had been driving it for 18 years without asking why. He got the angle grinder. He cut carefully along the short weld edge first, watching for anything close to the underside of the plate. The grinder threw sparks that died on the cab floor. The cut took 4 minutes. He set the grinder down and worked a pry bar under the loose edge and lifted. The plate came up. Underneath, in the space between the steel floor and the original wood subfloor that had been left in place, there was a metal box, painted olive-drab, the kind of paint the Army used on everything from 1942 through the late 1950s. The box was roughly 14 inches long, 8 inches wide, 4 inches deep. It had a hasp, but no padlock. The hasp was wired shut with steel wire that had oxidized to a dark brown. The wire was wrapped 3 times and twisted tight. Roy set the floor plate aside and picked up the box. It was heavier than it looked. He carried it to his workbench and set it down under the drop light. He stood there with his hands at his sides and looked at it for a moment. The olive-drab paint was chalky in places but intact. No rust on the seams. No moisture damage that he could see. Whatever was in there had been sealed well. He cut the wire with side cutters and opened the hasp and lifted the lid. The inside of the box was lined with oilcloth, the same type he'd seen wrapped around the wiring loom when he first bought the truck. On top of the oilcloth lay a folded envelope, sealed, with 2 words written on the front in pencil. For whoever. Below the envelope, wrapped separately in the oilcloth, were 3 items. Roy unwrapped them one at a time. The first was a discharge booklet. United States Army. The cover read, Separation Qualification Record. The name on the first page was Harlan G. Mabry. The date of separation was September 1945. He had served with the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion in the European theater. Roy turned the pages carefully. The service record was complete, every posting listed, every commendation noted. The last page had a photograph, a young man in uniform, maybe 22 years old, narrow face, ears that stood out slightly, a serious expression that was trying not to be proud and not entirely succeeding. The second item was a money clip. Sterling silver, engraved on the flat face with the initials H, G, M, and a date, June 12, 1948. A wedding date, Roy thought. The clip held nothing now. Whatever it had once held was gone. The third item was currency. Old bills, banded together with a rubber band that had dried and cracked and lay in 2 pieces beside the stack. Roy counted the money slowly, setting each bill flat on the workbench. Mostly 20s and 10s, a few 50s. He counted it twice. $4,200. He opened the envelope last. The letter inside was 2 pages, handwritten in the same pencil as the envelope. The hand of a man who had learned to write in a one-room schoolhouse and never lost the careful, deliberate style of it. My name is Harlan Mabry. I built this truck up from a straight chassis in 1961 and ran it for towing work out of Floyd County, Virginia, for 11 years. I am writing this in August of 1972, and I am 62 years old, and my heart is not good, and I know what that means for a man who has spent his life doing heavy work. I have a son, Thomas, who does not want the truck. He lives in Roanoke and works for the telephone company and has made clear to me that he has no use for a towing operation or the equipment that goes with it. I cannot say he is wrong. He built his life in a different direction, and I am not going to fault him for it. I have a daughter, Louise, who would have wanted the truck and who understood this kind of work the way some people just understand it from the time they are small. Louise died in 1969. She was 26 years old. She was killed on Route 8 in Patrick County by a driver who came across the center line on a wet night in November. I pulled the wreck myself because I was the closest operator and I did not know it was her car until I got there. I have been running this truck since then, mostly to have somewhere to be. The $4,200 in this box is money I set aside over 11 years for Louise's education and later for whatever she might have needed to get started. After she died, I could not spend it. It didn't seem like mine to spend anymore. So I kept it separate, and when I decided to put the truck up for sale, I put the money in the truck because I could not think of anywhere else it belonged. I am asking whoever finds this to use it for something that matters. I'm not able to be more specific than that because I do not know who you are or what year it is when you're reading this or what the world needs from you. I am trusting your judgment. A man who buys a used Mack wrecker and keeps it running is probably a man whose judgment is worth trusting. The discharge booklet and the money clip belong to me, and now they belong to you. The clip was a wedding gift from my wife, Eleanor. She died in 1964. The booklet is just a record of the time I spent in France and Belgium and Germany doing engineer work, building bridges and clearing roads, the kind of work that nobody remembers much but that had to get done. I'm not asking you to remember me. I'm just leaving the record in a place where it won't get thrown away with the paperwork. Take care of the truck. She has never given me a reason to doubt her in 11 years, and I do not expect she will give you one either. Harlan G., Mabry, Floyd County, Virginia, August 1972. Roy read the letter twice, standing at the workbench. Then he sat down on his shop stool and read it a third time. Outside, his wife's car pulled into the driveway. He heard the door, heard Connie call his name from inside the house, heard her come through to the shop. She found him at the bench with the letter in his hands and the open box beside him and the floor plate leaning against the cab. She read the letter without asking questions first. She set it down and looked at the discharge booklet. She looked at the money. How old would he be? She said. Roy figured it. 94 or -5, he said. If he's alive. He said his heart was bad in 1972. She looked at the truck. She looked at the money. She picked up the money clip and turned it in her fingers and set it back down. What are you going to do? She said. Roy looked at the floor plate, at the clean cuts his grinder had made along the short weld edge, at the work Harlan Mabry had done in 1972 to seal something away and trust at the time. Find his son, he said. Thomas Mabry. He'd be in his 60s now. Phone company in Roanoke. Connie was quiet for a moment. And the money? Roy thought about what Harlan Mabry had written. A man who buys a used Mack wrecker and keeps it running is probably a man whose judgment is worth trusting. I'll figure that out, Roy said. But first I need to find Thomas. He put the letter back in the envelope. He put the envelope in a box. He set the discharge booklet and the money clip in beside it and closed the lid. He did not reattach the hasp. He carried the box inside and set it on the kitchen table and went back to the shop to put the floor plate back in the cab, fitting it carefully over the empty space where it had sat for 33 years. The Thermodyne diesel sat silent in the bay. The Bulldog was still listing 5 degrees left on the hood, the same as the day he'd towed it home from Roanoke. The Holmes 501 stood straight above the cab in the shop light, 18 feet of steel that had never once failed to do what Roy asked of it. He closed the shop and went inside. Thomas Mabry was 67 years old and retired from the telephone company and living in a house in the Grandin Road neighborhood of Roanoke when Roy knocked on his door on a Saturday morning in May of 2005. Roy had found him through the county property records. It took 2 phone calls and an afternoon at the library. Thomas Mabry, same name his father had written in the letter 33 years ago. Roy had not called ahead. He was not sure how you called ahead for something like this. A woman answered the door. Roy introduced himself and asked for Thomas. She looked at him the way people look at strangers on Saturday mornings. He told her he had something that belonged to her husband's family. She let him in. Thomas Mabry came down the hallway in a flannel shirt and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He was a tall man gone thin with age, the kind of thin that comes from a lifetime of not eating more than you need. He looked at Roy the way his father had probably looked at machinery, measuring, unhurried. Roy set the Olive-Drab box on the kitchen table and told him where it had come from. He told him about the auction in 1987. He told him about the 18 years. He told him about the welds along the fourth edge of the floor plate and what he had found underneath. Thomas Mabry did not say anything for a long time after Roy finished. He opened the box. He picked up the discharge booklet and held it without opening it, just held it with both hands the way you hold something you were not sure you would ever see. He looked at the photograph on the first page for a long time. He set it down and picked up the money clip and turned it over and read the engraving and set it back in the box carefully. He did not pick up the money. "That's Eleanor's date," Thomas said. "June 12th, 48. My parents' wedding anniversary. My mother gave him that clip the year I was born." Roy waited. "He never told me he put the truck up for sale." Thomas said, "I was living in Roanoke by then. We didn't talk much that last year." He said, "He died in March of 73. 7 months after he wrote that letter. I sold the garage and the property, and I never knew what happened to the truck." He looked at the money. "He told me once he'd been putting money aside for Louise," Thomas said. "After she died, I asked him about it, and he said he'd taken care of it. I thought he meant he'd spent on the funeral. I didn't ask twice." Roy slid the envelope across the table. Thomas read the letter the way old men read things that cost them something, slowly, without expression, going back twice over certain lines. When he finished, he folded it along the original creases and put it back in the envelope and held it in his lap. The room was quiet. "Your father was right about one thing," Roy said. "The truck has never given me a reason to doubt her." Thomas looked up. "You still running it?" "Every week," Roy said. Thomas was quiet again for a moment. Then he said, "What are you going to do with the money?" Roy had thought about this for 3 weeks. He had talked to Connie about it. He had thought about what Harlan Mabry had written. Use it for something that matters. A man whose judgment is worth trusting. "I was hoping you'd help me figure that out," Roy said. "It was your father's. It was set aside for your sister. That makes it a family decision more than mine." Thomas shook his head slowly. He set the letter on the table. "My father left it for the man who found it. He was specific about that. He trusted your judgment. So do I." Roy thought about a young operator he knew in Franklin County, a man named Darius Cole, 29 years old, running one truck, good mechanic, the kind of careful worker who would still be doing this in 40 years if he could get through the next 2. Darius had told Roy 3 months earlier that he was behind on his equipment loan and the bank was sending letters. He told Thomas about Darius. Thomas listened. He picked up the money clip one more time and looked at it and set it down. He said, "That sounds like exactly what my father had in mind." Roy drove to Franklin County the following week. He found Darius Cole in his shop on a Tuesday afternoon, lying under a Ford F-350 with a bad differential. Roy waited until he came out. He told him he had something for him. He told him it wasn't a loan. He told him there was one condition. Darius wiped his hands on a shop rag and looked at the envelope Roy was holding. "What's the condition?" Darius said. "Someday you'll know somebody who's where you are right now," Roy said. "When that day comes, you do the same thing." Darius stood there for a moment. He took the envelope. He looked inside. He looked back at Roy. "Where did this come from?" Darius said. Roy told him about Harlan Mabry, about the B-61, about the letter and the Olive-Drab box, and the 33 years it sat under the cab floor waiting. He told him about Thomas. He told him about Louise. Darius was quiet for a long time after Roy finished. Then he said, "I'll take care of it." Roy believed him. The B-61 is still in Roy's Bay in Boudetort County. He retired it from recovery work in 2019 when his back made the cab climb too much, but he starts it twice a year and lets it run. The Holmes 501 stands straight above the cab. The Mack Bulldog is still listing 5 degrees left on the hood, same as the day Curtis Ellerby called it an anchor and took $325 for it. The discharge booklet sits in a frame on Thomas Mabry's wall in Roanoke. The money clip is in a small cedar box on his dresser beside his wife's jewelry. He told Roy once that he looks at the clip every morning when he gets dressed. Not out of grief, he said, out of something that doesn't have a clean word for it. The feeling of a thing that went away and came back. Roy doesn't talk about the box much. If someone asks about the B-61, he'll tell them it's a good truck and let the conversation go from there. He's not a man who needs the story to be known. He just needed it to go to the right place. Harlan Mabry trusted the truck to time and trusted the money to whoever found it and trusted his judgment to whoever that man turned out to be. Roy Decker paid $325 for a dead Mack at an auction in Roanoke and spent 18 years not knowing what he was keeping safe. Curtis Ellerby called it an anchor. He wasn't wrong about the weight of the thing. He just didn't understand what some weight is for. Thank you for staying with this one to the end. If this story meant something to you, check out the other Iron Witnesses videos on your screen now. There's plenty more old iron with stories to tell. Subscribe if you haven't yet. I'll see you at the next one. Nobody laughed at the Brockway after Granby Center. Raymond Steck never mentioned the auction again. Garrett Volk filed a county report citing the recovery as a textbook low-angle extraction. Word moved through the tow community the way word always moves, slow, then all at once. Lester kept running the truck. No interviews. No photographs for the trade papers. When a record museum in Cortland called about acquiring the Holmes 600, he thanked them and declined. The Brockway still works Oswego County roads. Dieter Hass's name is on the boom now, stenciled in white beside Lester's. That's all it needed. Thank you for staying with this one to the end. If this story meant something to you, check out the other Iron Witnesses videos on your screen now. There's plenty more old iron with stories to tell. Subscribe if you haven't yet. I'll see you at the next one.